Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and terrifying periods. Tonight, we're going to explore something that changed the course of human civilization forever, the Black Death, or as it was known to those who lived through it, simply the pestilence. But this isn't just another story about death and despair. This is a story about human resilience, ingenuity, and the incredible ways people found to survive when the world seemed to be ending around them. We're going to journey back to the 14th century, to a time when a mysterious disease swept across continents, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people, somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's population. But here's what's truly remarkable. Millions of people did survive. They found ways to adapt, to protect themselves, to rebuild their communities, and to emerge from this catastrophe with new knowledge, new social structures, and new hope for the future. Tonight, we'll walk through the stories of merchants who changed their trade routes, of doctors who developed new treatments despite having no understanding of germs, of entire communities that isolated themselves successfully, of religious groups that found meaning in chaos, and of ordinary families who made extraordinary choices that kept them alive. We'll discover how some of the survival strategies developed during the plague years laid the foundation for modern medicine, public health, and even our economic systems. This is a story that spans decades, crosses continents, and touches every level of society, from peasants to kings. It's a story of human creativity in the face of the unknown, of communities coming together when everything else fell apart, and of the birth of ideas that would shape our world for centuries to come. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The year was 1347, and Giovanni Boccaccio was living in Florence when something began to change in his world. He wouldn't know it at the time, but he was about to witness and document one of the most significant events in human history. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, carried by merchant ships from the East, and it would transform everything people thought they knew about life, death, medicine, and survival. But let's start at the very beginning, because to understand how people survived the Black Plague, we first need to understand what they were up against. The disease that would become known as the Black Death was actually bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Of course, the people of the 14th century had no knowledge of bacteria or germs. To them, this was a mysterious curse, perhaps sent by God, maybe caused by bad air, or possibly the result of an unusual alignment of the planets. The medieval world of the 1340s was already a precarious place to live. Most people lived in small villages or crowded cities where sanitation was primitive at best. Streets were often filled with human and animal waste, and clean water was scarce. Houses were built close together, families shared sleeping spaces with their livestock, and personal hygiene was limited by lack of access to soap and clean water. These conditions, while normal for the time, created perfect environments for disease transmission, though people had no understanding of this connection. The population of Europe had been growing steadily throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, leading to overcrowding in many areas. Forests had been cleared for farmland. Cities had expanded beyond their walls, and competition for resources was intense. Many regions were experiencing food shortages even before the plague arrived, as agricultural production struggled to keep pace with population growth. This meant that when the plague struck, many people were already weakened by malnutrition and living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that made them even more vulnerable to disease. The social structure of medieval Europe was rigid and hierarchical. At the top were kings and nobles who owned vast estates and wielded political power. Below them were knights and lesser nobles who served as warriors and administrators. The vast majority of the population consisted of peasants who worked the land, craftsmen who made goods in towns and cities, and clergy who served the church. This social structure was considered divinely ordained and unchangeable, but the plague would challenge and transform these assumptions in ways no one could have imagined. Communication across medieval Europe was slow and unreliable. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, and news from distant places might take weeks or months to arrive. This meant that when the plague began spreading across the continent, most communities had little or no advance warning. They couldn't prepare for what was coming because they didn't know it was coming. This lack of information networks would prove to be one of the greatest challenges in developing effective survival strategies. The plague traveled along the Silk Road, those ancient trade routes that connected east and west. It had been devastating parts of Asia for years before it reached the Mediterranean. The disease had originated in the steppes of Central Asia, where it lived naturally in populations of wild rodents. Climate changes and human activities had disturbed these natural plague reservoirs, allowing the disease to spread into human populations through the network of traders, soldiers, and travelers who moved along the Silk Road. The journey of the plague from Central Asia to Europe took several years and followed the major trade routes of the medieval world. From its origins in the Asian steppes, it spread south into China and India, west into the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire, and eventually reached the Mediterranean ports that connected the Eastern and Western worlds. Each step of this journey was facilitated by human trade and travel, as merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats unknowingly carried infected fleas and rats from region to region. The Black Sea ports played a crucial role in the plague's westward spread. Cities like Kaffa, in what is now Crimea, were major trading centers where goods and people from across Asia and Europe came together. When the plague reached these ports, it found ideal conditions for transmission: crowded markets, ships from many different regions, and extensive networks of travelers heading in all directions. From these Black Sea ports, the plague spread rapidly to Constantinople, the great city that controlled access to the Mediterranean and connected the Byzantine Empire with Western Europe. When Genoese trading ships arrived in the port of Messina in Sicily in October 1347, they brought with them not just goods from the east, but also black rats infected with fleas carrying the plague bacterium. Most of the sailors on these ships were already dead or dying. their bodies covered in the dark swellings that would give the disease its terrifying name. The surviving sailors told horrifying stories of entire crews dying during the voyage, of ships found drifting empty on the Mediterranean, and of ports where the dead outnumbered the living. The authorities in Messina quickly realized that something was terribly wrong with these ships and attempted to turn them away, but it was already too late. The rats had already come ashore, carrying their infected fleas into the city's grain stores, warehouses, and residential areas. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill with the mysterious disease. Within weeks, the plague had spread throughout Sicily and was beginning to appear in ports across the Mediterranean. The symptoms were horrifying and seemed to come from nowhere. People would wake up feeling fine and be dead by evening. The disease manifested in several forms. The most common was bubonic plague, characterized by painful swellings called buboes that appeared in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. These could grow as large as apples and were excruciatingly painful. The septicemic form attacked the blood system, causing internal bleeding that showed up as dark patches under the skin, hence the name Black Death. The most deadly form was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through coughing and breathing. The speed at which the plague killed was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. Unlike other diseases that medieval people were familiar with, which might take weeks or months to run their course, the plague could kill within hours or days of the first symptoms appearing. This rapid progression meant that there was little time for traditional treatments to take effect, little time for people to prepare for death, and little time for communities to organize responses to the crisis. The physical symptoms of the plague were unlike anything people had seen before. The buboes were not just painful, but grotesquely disfiguring, often growing so large that victims could not move their arms or legs. The internal bleeding caused by septicemic plague created dark, spreading patches under the skin that looked like bruises, but were actually signs of massive internal organ failure. Victims of pneumonic plague coughed up blood and struggled to breathe, their lungs filling with fluid and blood until they essentially drowned in their own bodily fluids. Beyond the physical symptoms, the plague also caused severe psychological and neurological effects. Many victims experienced delirium, hallucinations, and extreme agitation in their final hours. Some became violent or erratic in their behavior, while others fell into deep stupors from which they never awakened. These mental effects were particularly disturbing to observers, as they suggested that the plague was attacking not just the body, but also the mind and soul. The smell associated with plague was another aspect that terrorized medieval people. The combination of infected buboes, internal bleeding, and rapid decomposition after death created an odor that was unlike anything people had experienced. This smell became associated with impending death and was said to be detectable even before other symptoms appeared. Many people believed that this odor was itself dangerous and tried to mask it with strong perfumes, incense, and aromatic herbs. In those first months after the plague's arrival in Europe, people had no idea how to respond. The medical knowledge of the time was based on the ancient Greek physician Galen's theories about the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this understanding, disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors in the body. Doctors, called physicians, tried to treat plague victims by bloodletting, purging with laxatives, and attempting to balance the humors through various herbal concoctions. But some people, even in those first terrifying months, began to notice patterns. They observed that the disease seemed to spread faster in crowded areas, that it followed trade routes, and that it appeared to jump from household to household. These observations would become the foundation for the survival strategies that would eventually help millions of people escape death. The most perceptive observers began to notice that certain occupations seemed more vulnerable to the plague than others. Doctors and priests who came into close contact with plague victims died in disproportionately high numbers. Merchants and travelers who moved frequently between communities also seemed particularly susceptible. On the other hand, some hermits and isolated communities seemed to escape the plague entirely, leading people to wonder if there was something about human contact that facilitated the disease's spread. People also noticed geographical patterns in the plague's spread. Coastal cities and major river ports were often hit first and hardest, while remote mountain villages and isolated rural areas might remain unaffected for months or years. Major roads and trade routes seemed to channel the disease from one community to another, while areas that were off the beaten path were often spared. These observations led to the first systematic attempts to understand how the plague spread and what might be done to prevent it. Weather patterns also seemed to influence the plague's behavior, though people at the time didn't understand why. The disease appeared to be most active during warmer months and seemed to slow down or even disappear during particularly cold winters. Some regions noticed that wet, humid weather seemed to worsen outbreaks, while dry conditions might slow the spread. These climatic observations would later influence decisions about when to travel, when to implement quarantine measures, and when it might be safe to return to previously affected areas. The social patterns of plague transmission were particularly disturbing to medieval observers. Families would often be completely wiped out within days, while neighboring households might remain completely unaffected. Sometimes, the plague would devastate one neighborhood while leaving adjacent areas untouched. These seemingly random patterns of death and survival challenged medieval understanding of divine justice and natural order, leading to profound questions about why some people were spared while others perished. One of the first and most effective survival strategies was simply running away. This might seem obvious to us now, but in medieval society, most people were tied to the land where they were born. Peasants were bound to their lord's estates. Craftsmen belonged to guilds in specific cities, and social mobility was extremely limited. The plague changed all of that, at least temporarily. When death seemed certain by staying, people abandoned centuries-old social conventions and fled. The wealthy were the first to embrace this strategy. They had the resources to leave their homes, maintain households in multiple locations, and wait out the plague in remote areas. Boccaccio wrote about a group of young nobles who fled Florence and spent months in a countryside villa, telling stories to pass the time. This became the framework for his famous work, the Decameron, but it was also a real survival strategy employed by thousands of wealthy Europeans. The flight strategy required considerable planning and resources. Wealthy families needed to identify safe destinations, arrange for supplies and accommodations, coordinate the movement of large households, including servants and retainers, and ensure that their properties and business interests would be maintained during their absence. Some noble families maintained multiple residences specifically for this purpose, with country estates, mountain retreats, or island properties that could serve as refuges during plague outbreaks. The timing of flight was crucial for its success. Families who left too early might spend months or years in uncomfortable exile only to return and find that the plague had arrived in their absence. Those who waited too long might find themselves trapped by the rapid spread of disease or unable to travel safely through plague-affected areas. The most successful refugees were those who maintained networks of correspondence, who could provide up-to-date information about plague conditions in different regions, allowing them to make informed decisions about when and where to flee. The logistics of flight were complicated by the need to bring essential supplies and personnel. Wealthy households might include dozens or even hundreds of people, family members, servants, guards, craftsmen, and others whose skills were necessary for maintaining the household. Moving such large groups required extensive planning, multiple wagons or ships, and careful coordination to ensure that everyone reached the destination safely. Many wealthy families found it necessary to split up during flight, with different family members going to different refuges to reduce the risk of losing entire family lines to a single plague outbreak. The destinations chosen for flight varied widely depending on resources, connections, and geographic location. Some wealthy families fled to remote country estates where they could maintain comfortable lifestyles while remaining isolated from plague-affected populations. Others chose mountain retreats, island properties, or fortified locations that could be easily defended and isolated. Some even left their home countries entirely, fleeing to regions that had not yet been affected by the plague. But flight wasn't just for the rich. Entire communities sometimes picked up and moved when the plague appeared. In England, there are records of villages that were completely abandoned, their residents scattering to the countryside to live as best they could until the danger passed. Some of these lost villages can still be seen today as earthworks and ruins in English fields, testament to communities that chose survival over stability. The phenomenon of village abandonment was particularly common in areas where the plague struck with devastating speed. When half or more of a village's population died within weeks, the survivors often concluded that the location itself was cursed or poisoned, and that their only hope was to flee to new locations. These mass migrations created streams of refugees moving across the European countryside, carrying their portable possessions and seeking new places to settle. Some communities organized their flight collectively, with village leaders coordinating group movements to predetermined safe locations. These organized evacuations were often more successful than individual flight attempts because they allowed communities to maintain their social structures and mutual support systems even while relocating. Villages might move together to remote valleys, uninhabited forests, or abandoned settlements, establishing temporary communities that could provide mutual protection and assistance. The decision to abandon a village was never taken lightly, as it meant giving up homes, farms, and ancestral lands that families had worked for generations. However, some communities found that collective flight actually strengthened their social bonds and created new opportunities for improvement. Villages that successfully relocated sometimes found better agricultural land, safer defensive positions, or more favorable economic conditions in their new locations. The success of the flight strategy depended largely on timing and destination. Those who left at the first sign of plague in their area and went to truly isolated locations had the best chance of survival. Mountain communities, remote islands, and sparsely populated rural areas became refuges for those who could reach them. The key was getting there before the plague did and staying isolated until it had passed through the region. However, flight wasn't always successful, and it wasn't always possible. Many people discovered that the plague had preceded them to their intended destinations. Others found that their resources couldn't sustain them in exile for the months or years it took for the plague to burn itself out in their home regions. And sometimes, people carried the disease with them, inadvertently spreading it to previously unaffected areas. The failure of flight strategies often had tragic consequences. Families who had spent their life savings on evacuation efforts might find themselves stranded in unfamiliar locations without resources or support networks. Refugees who carried the plague with them often faced hostility and violence from communities that blamed them for bringing the disease. Some refugee groups found themselves quarantined or expelled from multiple locations, becoming permanent wanderers with no place to settle safely. The psychological toll of failed flight attempts was enormous. People who had abandoned their homes, communities, and livelihoods in hope of survival often found themselves worse off than those who had stayed behind. The guilt of abandoning sick family members, the loss of social status and identity that came with becoming refugees, and the constant uncertainty about safety and future prospects created severe mental distress that sometimes proved as dangerous as the plague itself. Some communities developed hostile attitudes toward refugees and travelers, viewing them as potential carriers of plague. This led to the creation of barriers, guards, and exclusion policies that made flight increasingly difficult and dangerous. Roads might be blocked, bridges destroyed, or mountain passes guarded to prevent the entry of potentially infected travelers. These defensive measures, while sometimes effective at protecting individual communities, often trapped plague victims in affected areas and prevented the sharing of resources and information that might have helped with survival efforts. The legal and social complications of flight were also significant. Peasants who fled their lord's lands might be declared outlaws or rebels. Craftsmen who abandoned their guilds might lose their professional standing and livelihood. Merchants who fled during business obligations might face lawsuits and financial ruin. These legal consequences meant that flight was often a permanent life change rather than a temporary evacuation, as people who fled might find themselves unable to return to their previous lives even after the plague had passed. For those who couldn't or wouldn't flee, other survival strategies emerged. One of the most important was what we would now recognize as quarantine and isolation. Although people didn't understand the germ theory of disease, they could see that the plague spread from person to person and from place to place. This led to some of the first systematic public health measures in European history. The city-state of Venice was one of the pioneers in this area. Venetian authorities noticed that ships arriving from plague-affected ports often brought the disease with them. In 1348, they began requiring ships from infected ports to anchor offshore for 30 days before being allowed to dock. If no one on board had died or become ill during those 30 days, the ship was allowed into port. This period was later extended to 40 days, giving rise to the term quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. The 40-day quarantine became standard across Europe and the Mediterranean. It was based partly on medical theory. Physicians believed that 40 days was long enough for any disease to run its course, and partly on religious significance, as 40 was considered a sacred number in Christian tradition, appearing frequently in biblical stories. But quarantine wasn't just applied to ships. Entire cities began implementing isolation measures when the plague appeared within their walls. Milan, one of the most successful cities in terms of survival rates, implemented strict quarantine measures that were revolutionary for their time. When a case of plague was discovered in a household, the entire building was sealed shut with all its inhabitants inside. Food and water were passed through windows, but no one was allowed to leave until either everyone inside had died or 40 days had passed without any new cases. The Milanese quarantine system was overseen by special officials called the Commissioners of Health, who had extraordinary powers to enforce isolation measures. These commissioners could order the immediate sealing of buildings, the removal of infected individuals to special hospitals, and the destruction of contaminated goods. They maintained detailed records of every plague case, tracking the progression of the disease through different neighborhoods and family networks. This systematic approach to record-keeping provided valuable information for understanding plague transmission patterns and evaluating the effectiveness of different interventions. The enforcement of quarantine in Milan required the cooperation of numerous city officials and citizens. Guards were posted at sealed buildings to ensure that no one entered or left without authorization. City workers were assigned to deliver food and supplies to quarantined households, often leaving provisions at doors or passing them through windows to minimize contact. Priests were designated to provide spiritual comfort to quarantined families, conducting religious services from outside sealed buildings and administering last rites through windows when necessary. The social and economic impacts of Milan's quarantine system were enormous. Entire neighborhoods might be sealed off for weeks at a time, disrupting normal commerce and social life. Families were separated when some members were quarantined while others remained free. Children were sometimes orphaned when their parents died in quarantine, leading to the development of special institutions for caring for plague orphans. The psychological stress of quarantine, combined with the fear of plague, led to various forms of mental distress and social disruption. Despite these challenges, Milan's quarantine system proved remarkably effective. The city's death rate from plague was significantly lower than that of other major Italian cities that did not implement such strict measures. This success led other cities to adopt similar systems, though few implemented them as rigorously as Milan. The Milanese model became a template for plague control that influenced public health practices for centuries afterward. This might seem cruel by modern standards, but it was remarkably effective. Milan's death rate from the plague was significantly lower than that of other major Italian cities. The Milanese authorities had stumbled upon one of the key principles of epidemic control, breaking the chain of transmission by isolating infected individuals and their close contacts. The success of Milan's approach encouraged other cities to develop their own versions of systematic quarantine. Venice, with its extensive maritime trade connections, developed particularly sophisticated procedures for quarantining incoming ships and their crews. Venetian authorities established designated anchorage areas outside the main harbor where ships from plague-affected regions were required to wait. During this waiting period, ships were inspected regularly for signs of disease, and any vessels showing evidence of plague were either turned away or subjected to extended quarantine periods. The Venetian quarantine system also included procedures for handling cargo from plague-affected regions. Goods were often required to be aired and fumigated before being allowed into the city. Certain types of merchandise, particularly textiles and furs that were believed to harbor disease, might be banned entirely from plague-affected regions. These commercial quarantine measures had significant economic implications, as they could disrupt important trade relationships and cause substantial financial losses for merchants and the city government. Florence developed its own unique approach to quarantine, establishing a network of pest houses or lazarettos outside the city walls. These institutions served multiple functions. They provided isolation facilities for plague victims, quarantine accommodations for travelers from affected areas, and medical care facilities staffed by volunteers and religious orders. The Florentine lazaretto system became a model for other cities, demonstrating how quarantine facilities could be organized to provide both public health protection and humanitarian care. The design and operation of lazarettos reflected contemporary understanding of plague transmission and treatment. These facilities were typically built in isolated locations with good ventilation, as fresh air was believed to be important for preventing the spread of disease. They were often constructed with separate sections for different categories of patients: those with confirmed plague, those with suspected cases, and those undergoing precautionary quarantine. Some lazarettos included chapels, workshops, and gardens that allowed patients to maintain some form of normal activity during their isolation. Other cities developed their own variations of quarantine and isolation. Florence created plague hospitals, called lazarettos, where suspected plague victims were taken for observation and treatment. These institutions were often little more than places to die, but they did serve the crucial function of removing infected individuals from the general population. Some lazarettos were built on islands or in remote locations outside city walls, further reducing the risk of transmission. The concept of the lazaretto spread throughout Europe. These institutions varied widely in their quality and effectiveness, but they represented a revolutionary approach to public health. For the first time in European history, authorities were taking systematic, institutional approaches to controlling the spread of disease. The lazarettos were staffed by volunteers, often members of religious orders who saw caring for plague victims as a holy duty. Many of these caregivers died, but some survived, and their experiences contributed to the growing body of practical knowledge about plague prevention and treatment. Individual families also developed their own isolation strategies. Wealthy households might designate certain rooms as quarantine areas, where family members who showed symptoms could be isolated from the rest of the household. Servants who cared for plague victims were often required to live separately from other household staff. Some families even built separate buildings on their properties specifically for quarantine purposes. The domestic quarantine strategies developed by individual families varied widely depending on their resources, living situations, and understanding of disease transmission. Large households with multiple buildings had obvious advantages, as they could physically separate potentially infected individuals from healthy family members. Some wealthy families constructed special isolation buildings on their properties, complete with separate entrances, cooking facilities, and waste disposal systems that minimized contact with the main household. Within existing homes, families developed creative solutions for isolation and separation. They might designate specific staircases, doorways, or even entire floors for use by potentially infected individuals. Meals were often passed through doors or windows rather than shared at common tables. Some families established elaborate systems of signals, bells, flags, or coded knocks that allowed communication between quarantined and healthy household members without direct contact. The care of quarantined family members presented enormous challenges and required careful planning. Someone had to provide food, water, and medical attention to isolated individuals, but this caregiver role was obviously dangerous. Some families rotated this responsibility among different household members, while others designated specific individuals, often servants or those who had already been exposed to plague, as permanent caregivers. These caregivers often lived in isolation themselves, having contact only with the quarantined patients and communicating with the rest of the household through intermediaries. The emotional and psychological aspects of family quarantine were particularly difficult. Parents were separated from children, spouses from each other, and extended families were split apart at times when mutual support and comfort were most needed. Children who showed plague symptoms might be isolated from their parents, cared for only by servants or distant relatives. The psychological trauma of these separations sometimes proved as damaging as the physical disease itself. Wealthy families often maintained detailed records of their quarantine procedures, creating written protocols that could be followed during future plague outbreaks. These family quarantine manuals included instructions for recognizing plague symptoms, procedures for isolating affected individuals, guidelines for providing care while minimizing transmission risk, and protocols for determining when quarantine periods could safely end. Some of these family documents survived and provide valuable insights into how domestic quarantine systems functioned during the plague years. In rural areas, where formal medical care was often non-existent, communities developed their own isolation practices. Entire farms might be quarantined if plague appeared among the inhabitants. Neighboring farms would leave food at the boundaries of quarantined properties, often in exchange for money left in vinegar, which was believed to have disinfectant properties. These rural quarantine measures were often more effective than urban ones, because population density was lower and natural isolation was easier to maintain. Rural quarantine systems often relied on traditional community cooperation networks that had developed for other purposes, such as barn raising, harvest assistance, and emergency aid during natural disasters. When plague appeared on a farm, neighboring families would automatically assume responsibility for providing essential supplies and maintaining isolated properties while the affected family recovered or died. These rural mutual aid systems were often more flexible and responsive than formal urban quarantine institutions. The agricultural calendar influenced rural quarantine practices in important ways. Quarantine during planting or harvest seasons could have catastrophic economic consequences for farming families, as missed agricultural deadlines could result in crop failures and food shortages that might prove more dangerous than the plague itself. Rural communities often developed sophisticated systems for maintaining agricultural activities while still implementing effective isolation measures. Some rural areas developed rotation systems where different farms or households would take turns being responsible for essential community functions during plague outbreaks. While one farm was in quarantine, neighboring properties might take over responsibility for maintaining livestock, protecting crops, or providing security. This system allowed for continued agricultural productivity while still maintaining effective disease control measures. The geographic advantages of rural areas, lower population density, natural barriers between households, and self-sufficient agricultural systems made quarantine more practical and effective than in urban environments. Rural families could often achieve complete isolation more easily than city dwellers, and they had better access to food, water, and other essential resources needed to sustain long quarantine periods. Along with quarantine and isolation, people developed various strategies for avoiding infection in the first place. Since they didn't understand that the plague was transmitted by fleas from infected rats, many of their precautions were based on incorrect theories about disease transmission. However, some of these measures were surprisingly effective, even if for the wrong reasons. The predominant medical theory of the time held that disease was transmitted through miasma, bad air, or poisonous vapors. This led to numerous strategies designed to purify the air or protect against contaminated air. People burned aromatic woods, herbs, and spices in their homes and places of business. Juniper, rosemary, thyme, and other strong-smelling plants were particularly popular. While these didn't actually prevent plague transmission, they did make living spaces more pleasant and may have had some limited antimicrobial effects. The famous plague doctor costume, with its long beaked mask, was designed specifically to protect against miasma. The beak was filled with aromatic substances, cloves, cinnamon, dried roses, and other spices that were believed to filter out poisonous air. The rest of the costume included a long leather or waxed canvas coat, gloves, boots, and a hat, all designed to prevent any part of the doctor's body from coming into contact with contaminated air or surfaces. While the costume didn't actually protect against plague transmission as intended, it may have provided some protection by creating a barrier between the doctor and patients, and the long stick carried by plague doctors allowed them to examine patients without direct contact. People also changed their daily habits in ways they hoped would protect them from infection. Many avoided crowds and public gatherings, which was actually quite effective since it reduced opportunities for transmission. Markets, churches, and other gathering places saw dramatic decreases in attendance during plague outbreaks. Some cities banned public assemblies entirely during plague periods. Personal hygiene practices also changed, though not always in ways we would consider beneficial today. Some people bathed frequently, believing that cleanliness would protect them from disease. Others avoided bathing entirely, thinking that water might carry the infection, or that opening the pores through bathing made the body more susceptible to poisonous air. Both approaches had their adherents, and both groups included both survivors and victims. The medieval understanding of personal hygiene was complex and often contradictory. The classical tradition, inherited from Greek and Roman medicine, generally favored cleanliness and regular bathing. However, Christian theological influences had introduced suspicion of bodily pleasures, including the luxury of warm baths. The plague crisis intensified these contradictions as people struggled to determine which practices might protect them from disease. Those who favored increased bathing during plague times often combined washing with other protective practices. They might bathe in water infused with herbs believed to have medicinal properties: rosemary, thyme, sage, or other aromatic plants. Some people added vinegar or wine to their bathwater, believing these substances could counteract poisonous influences. The wealthy might import exotic spices and oils from distant lands, creating elaborate bathing rituals that were thought to provide protection against plague. The anti-bathing faction based their practices on the belief that opening the pores through warm water bathing made the body more vulnerable to the miasmic influences that were thought to cause plague. They argued that a clean but closed skin surface provided better protection against poisonous air. Some physicians of the time supported this view, recommending that people avoid bathing and instead focus on keeping their clothing and living spaces clean. The clothing and textile practices that developed during plague times reflected these conflicting theories about personal protection. Some people changed their clothing frequently and washed garments regularly, believing that clean clothes would protect against disease. Others wore the same garments for extended periods, believing that frequent clothing changes might expose them to contaminated air or materials. The wealthy often abandoned their usual elaborate costumes for simpler, more practical clothing that could be more easily cleaned or discarded if contamination was suspected. Fabric choices also reflected plague time concerns about disease transmission. Smooth fabrics like silk or linen were sometimes preferred because they were thought to harbor fewer disease-causing influences than rough woolen materials. Dark-colored clothing became popular in some areas because it was believed to be less attractive to the evil influences that caused plague. Some people wore special plague protection garments made from materials that were thought to have protective properties: leather, waxed cloth, or fabrics treated with aromatic oils. Hair care practices were similarly influenced by plague concerns. Some people shaved their heads completely, believing that hair could harbor disease-causing influences. Others grew their hair long and covered it completely, thinking that exposed hair might attract harmful substances from the air. Various oils, pomades, and aromatic treatments were applied to hair in hopes of protection against plague transmission. The use of perfumes, oils, and aromatic substances became widespread during plague times, driven by the belief that pleasant smells could counteract the poisonous odors associated with disease. People carried small containers of aromatic substances, pomanders filled with spices, bottles of scented oils, or sachets of dried herbs. These personal aromatic protections were worn on the body, carried in pockets, or suspended from belts and clothing. Dental and oral hygiene practices also evolved in response to plague concerns. Many people believed that the mouth was a primary entry point for disease-causing influences, leading to increased attention to oral cleanliness. Some people chewed aromatic herbs or spices regularly, believing this would protect against infection. Others avoided certain foods or drinks that were thought to make the mouth more susceptible to disease influences. Diet was another area where people tried to protect themselves through prevention. Medieval medical theory held that diet could influence the body's humoral balance and thus its susceptibility to disease. During plague outbreaks, people avoided foods that were considered hot or moist in their humoral properties, such as fresh fruits and vegetables, which were thought to make the body more susceptible to the plague's influence. Instead, they favored cold and dry foods like bread, wine, and preserved meats. Ironically, this dietary change may have contributed to nutritional deficiencies that actually made people more vulnerable to disease. Spices and strong-tasting foods were particularly prized during plague times, both for their supposed protective properties and because they were expensive and rare, making them status symbols for those who could afford them. Garlic, onions, and vinegar were considered especially protective. People would eat these foods regularly and carry them as charms or amulets. While these foods don't actually prevent plague, garlic and onions do have some antimicrobial properties, and vinegar was sometimes used as a primitive disinfectant. Religious practices also became survival strategies for many people during the plague years. The medieval worldview was deeply religious, and many people interpreted the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins. This led to various religious practices designed to appease divine wrath and secure divine protection. Prayer and religious devotion intensified during plague outbreaks. Churches that remained open often saw increased attendance, despite the obvious risks of gathering in crowded spaces. Many people made pilgrimages to holy sites, seeking divine intervention or spiritual purification. Some joined penitential movements, participating in public displays of repentance designed to turn aside God's anger. The most extreme of these religious movements were the flagellants, groups of men who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves and each other in public displays of penance. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could take on the sins of their communities and convince God to end the plague. While this practice had no medical benefit and may have actually spread disease by bringing together people from different communities, it provided psychological comfort to many and gave people a sense that they were taking active steps to combat the plague. Other religious practices were more practical and may have had actual protective benefits. Many religious communities implemented their own quarantine measures, isolating monasteries and convents from the outside world during plague outbreaks. Some religious orders specialized in caring for plague victims, developing practical experience in nursing and infection control that made them more effective caregivers and increased their own survival rates. The plague years also saw an increase in charitable activities as wealthy individuals and institutions tried to secure divine favor through good works. This had the practical effect of providing care and resources for plague victims and their families. Hospitals, almshouses, and other charitable institutions were founded or expanded during plague years. These institutions provided not just spiritual comfort, but also practical assistance with food, shelter, and medical care. Personal protective devices and charms became common during plague outbreaks. People wore amulets, carried lucky objects, and used various substances they believed would protect them from infection. Some of these practices were based on religious beliefs, carrying relics of saints, wearing blessed medallions, or using holy water. Others were based on folk medicine or superstition, carrying certain stones, wearing specific colors, or avoiding particular numbers or days. While most of these protective practices had no actual medical benefit, they may have provided important psychological benefits. Having a sense of control and taking active steps to protect oneself could reduce stress and anxiety, which might have had positive effects on overall health and immune function. Additionally, some protective practices had unintended benefits. For example, people who wore face coverings or avoided crowds for superstitious reasons were actually reducing their risk of infection. As the plague continued year after year, people began to develop more sophisticated strategies based on their observations and experiences. Communities that had survived initial outbreaks began to document what had worked and what hadn't, creating the first systematic approaches to plague prevention and control. Trade and commerce, initially devastated by the plague, gradually adapted to the new reality. Merchants developed new practices for conducting business safely during plague outbreaks. They established protocols for inspecting goods and workers, created systems for trading without direct contact, and developed networks of information about which areas were currently affected by plague. Some merchants specialized in serving plague-affected areas, developing expertise in safe trading practices, and commanding premium prices for their willingness to take risks. These traders often developed their own protective rituals and practices, some of which were surprisingly effective. They might quarantine goods for specific periods before handling them, use gloves and other protective clothing when dealing with customers, and maintain detailed records of where they had been and whom they had contacted. The banking systems that were developing in Italian city-states proved particularly adaptable to plague conditions. Banks could conduct business through letters of credit and other paper instruments, reducing the need for direct contact between merchants and customers. This led to innovations in banking and finance that would have far-reaching effects beyond the plague years. Agricultural communities developed their own survival strategies, often centered around self-sufficiency and isolation. Farms that could produce all their own food and necessities could isolate themselves completely during plague outbreaks, reducing their contact with potentially infected people from towns and cities. These agricultural communities often had lower death rates than urban areas, partly due to lower population density and partly due to their ability to maintain isolation. Some agricultural areas developed rotating systems where different communities would take turns going into isolation. While one village or district was isolated, neighboring communities would handle essential tasks like maintaining trade connections or caring for livestock. This system allowed for continued economic activity while still providing protection through isolation. The plague years also saw innovations in food preservation and storage. Communities that might need to endure long periods of isolation needed to be able to store food for extended periods. This led to improvements in techniques for preserving meat, grain, and vegetables. Some of these innovations, such as improved methods for smoking and salting meat, would have lasting effects on European cuisine and food culture. Medical practices, though still based on incorrect theories about disease, gradually became more sophisticated through trial and error. Physicians who survived multiple plague outbreaks developed practical experience that made them more effective, even if they didn't understand the true nature of the disease they were treating. Some doctors began to notice that certain treatments seemed more effective than others. While bloodletting remained the standard treatment, some physicians began to modify their practices based on their observations. They might use different types of cuts, remove smaller amounts of blood, or combine bloodletting with other treatments. Some began to focus more on pain relief and comfort care rather than attempting to cure the disease. Herbal medicine became increasingly sophisticated during the plague years. Physicians and apothecaries experimented with different combinations of herbs and observed their effects on patients. While none of these treatments could cure plague, some may have provided symptom relief or comfort to patients. The extensive experimentation with medicinal plants during this period contributed to the development of pharmacology and laid groundwork for later medical advances. The role of women in medical care expanded during the plague years. With so many male physicians dying or fleeing plague-affected areas, women often took on caregiving roles traditionally reserved for men. Some women became recognized experts in treating plague symptoms, developing reputations that allowed them to practice medicine more openly than had been possible before the plague. Midwives, who already had medical knowledge and experience, often expanded their practices to include plague care. They developed networks for sharing information about treatments and sharing resources. Some communities came to rely heavily on these female medical practitioners during plague outbreaks. Family structures and household management evolved in response to plague conditions. Families developed contingency plans for who would take over household management if parents died. Children were often sent to live with relatives in unaffected areas, not just to protect them from infection, but also to ensure the continuation of family lines. Some families developed elaborate succession plans, designating multiple backup guardians for children and creating detailed instructions for the management of property and business interests. Wills became more common and more detailed during plague years, as people tried to ensure that their wishes would be followed even if entire families died. Marriage patterns changed as well. Some communities saw increases in marriage rates as people sought to form new household alliances for mutual protection and support. Others saw decreases as people avoided the gatherings typically associated with weddings. Some couples developed informal partnerships during plague years, delaying formal marriage ceremonies until the danger had passed. The care of orphans became a major social issue during plague outbreaks. With so many children losing their parents, communities had to develop new systems for childcare. Some religious institutions specialized in caring for plague orphans. Some communities created formal apprenticeship programs that served as both childcare and job training. Extended family networks became crucial for child survival as aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins took in children whose parents had died. Economic systems adapted in remarkable ways to plague conditions. With traditional labor systems disrupted by death and flight, new forms of economic organization emerged. Some communities developed cooperative systems where remaining residents shared labor and resources. Others saw the emergence of new forms of entrepreneurship as individuals found ways to profit from plague-related needs. The shortage of workers that resulted from plague deaths led to significant changes in labor practices. Surviving workers could often command higher wages and better working conditions. Some peasants were able to abandon serfdom and become free laborers. Skilled craftsmen became particularly valuable and could often dictate their own terms of employment. Some communities developed new forms of social organization designed specifically for survival during plague years. These might include formal agreements about resource sharing, mutual aid during illness, or systems for maintaining essential services when normal social structures broke down. Some of these arrangements proved so beneficial that they continued even after the plague had passed. The legal system also adapted to plague conditions. Courts developed procedures for handling the large numbers of inheritance cases that resulted from plague deaths. Legal professionals created new forms of documentation designed to function even when traditional witnesses and authorities might not be available. Some communities developed emergency legal procedures that could function with minimal personnel. As the plague continued over multiple years and multiple outbreaks, some communities began to develop what we might recognize as early forms of public health systems. These were simple by modern standards, but they represented systematic attempts to protect community health through collective action. Some cities appointed special officials responsible for plague prevention and response. These officials might be responsible for inspecting ships and travelers, maintaining quarantine facilities, coordinating the care of plague victims, or ensuring the proper disposal of bodies. While these early public health officials had limited medical knowledge, they often developed practical expertise that made them effective at reducing disease transmission. Community-wide sanitation efforts became more common during plague years. While people didn't understand the connection between sanitation and disease transmission, some communities began systematic efforts to clean streets, remove waste, and maintain cleaner living conditions. These efforts were often motivated by the belief that bad smells and dirty conditions contributed to the poisonous air that was thought to cause plague. Some cities began to regulate activities that were thought to contribute to plague transmission. These might include restrictions on certain types of trade, requirements for the disposal of animal carcasses, or rules about the maintenance of public spaces. While the scientific basis for these regulations was often incorrect, some of them may have had beneficial effects. Information networks became crucial for survival during plague years. Communities that could get accurate, timely information about plague outbreaks in other areas could make better decisions about trade, travel, and protective measures. This led to the development of more sophisticated communication systems, including networks of messengers, signal systems, and regular correspondence between communities. Merchants and travelers became important sources of information about plague conditions in distant areas. Some communities began to systematically collect and share this information, creating early forms of disease surveillance systems. Maps showing plague-affected areas were created and updated regularly, allowing people to make informed decisions about where to go and where to avoid. Religious networks also served important information-sharing functions. Monasteries, churches, and pilgrimage routes became conduits for information about plague conditions across wide geographical areas. Religious authorities often maintained correspondence networks that could rapidly spread information about outbreaks and successful prevention measures. The psychological aspects of survival became increasingly important as the plague continued year after year. Communities developed various strategies for maintaining morale and mental health during extended periods of crisis. Some of these approaches were based on religious or philosophical beliefs, while others were more practical. Storytelling became an important survival tool. Communities that could maintain cultural activities like storytelling, music, and art often had better morale and stronger social cohesion. Boccaccio's Decameron wasn't just literature. It was a model for how people could maintain their humanity and hope during the darkest times. Maintaining routines and normal activities insofar as possible helped people cope with the stress and uncertainty of plague years. Communities that could continue some form of regular economic, social, and religious activities often fared better than those where normal life completely broke down. The development of community support systems became crucial for psychological survival. Neighbors looked after each other, shared resources and information, and provided emotional support during times of loss and fear. Some communities formalized these support systems, creating official roles for people who would check on others, provide assistance to the sick, or help with funeral arrangements. Education and knowledge preservation became survival strategies for some communities. With so many learned people dying, some communities made special efforts to preserve important knowledge and skills. This might involve training multiple people in essential crafts, creating written records of important techniques, or establishing schools to ensure the continuation of literacy and learning. Some communities developed specialized roles for people who would maintain essential knowledge during plague outbreaks. These might include physicians who would record their observations about treatments, craftsmen who would document their techniques, or scholars who would copy important manuscripts. This knowledge preservation effort helped communities recover more quickly after plague outbreaks ended. The role of leadership became particularly important during plague years. Communities with effective leadership often had better survival rates than those without strong organization. Effective plague-era leaders were those who could maintain order and organization while also being flexible enough to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Some communities saw the emergence of new types of leaders during plague years. These might be people with medical knowledge, those with organizational skills, or individuals who could maintain morale during difficult times. Some of these emergency leaders continued in authority roles even after the plague had passed, permanently changing the social and political structures of their communities. Religious leadership also evolved during plague years. Some religious leaders fled when plague appeared, while others stayed to care for their communities. Those who stayed often developed new forms of religious practice adapted to plague conditions. They might conduct services outdoors to reduce crowding, develop new rituals for caring for the sick and dying, or create new theological explanations for the plague that helped people cope with their circumstances. The development of early warning systems became increasingly sophisticated as people gained experience with multiple plague outbreaks. Communities began to recognize the early signs that plague was approaching and developed procedures for implementing protective measures before the disease actually arrived in their area. These early warning systems might be based on information from travelers and traders, observation of animal behavior, or monitoring of conditions in nearby communities. Some communities developed formal procedures for implementing quarantine measures, isolating vulnerable individuals, or preparing medical facilities based on early warning information. The timing of protective measures proved crucial for their effectiveness. Communities that implemented isolation and quarantine measures too late often saw them overwhelmed by the rapid spread of disease. Those that acted quickly, based on early warning information, had much better success rates. Seasonal patterns also became part of survival strategies. People observed that plague outbreaks often followed seasonal patterns, being worse in some seasons than others. While they didn't understand the biological reasons for these patterns, they could use their observations to plan activities, travel, and protective measures for times when risk was lower. Some communities developed seasonal migration patterns, moving to safer locations during high-risk periods and returning during times when plague risk was lower. These movements might be based on climate patterns, trade cycles, or religious calendars, but they represented sophisticated adaptations to plague conditions. The development of specialized plague-fighting expertise became an important survival tool for individuals and communities. People who survived multiple plague outbreaks often developed practical knowledge that made them valuable to other communities facing plague threats. Some individuals became traveling plague experts, moving from community to help implement protective measures and treat plague victims. These experts might be physicians, religious figures, or simply experienced survivors who had learned effective techniques through trial and error. Communities began to formally recognize and compensate plague expertise. They might offer special payments to experienced caregivers, provide incentives for medical personnel to remain during outbreaks, or create official positions for plague prevention specialists. The development of trade networks specifically adapted to plague conditions allowed some communities to maintain essential commerce even during outbreaks. These networks might involve special protocols for handling goods, designated trading locations outside populated areas, or systems for conducting business without direct human contact. Some merchants developed specialized equipment and techniques for safe trading during plague times. They might use long-handled tools for passing goods, maintain separate storage areas for goods from plague-affected regions, or employ complex purification rituals before handling trade items. The banking and credit systems that developed during this period allowed for commercial activity even when direct contact was dangerous or impossible. Letters of credit, promissory notes, and other financial instruments meant that trade could continue without the physical exchange of money or goods. Technology and innovation accelerated in some areas as people sought new solutions to plague-related problems. This might include improvements in protective equipment, better methods for food preservation, or new techniques for maintaining sanitation. The printing press, which was developed during the later plague years, revolutionized the spread of information about plague prevention and treatment. Printed materials allowed for the rapid dissemination of medical knowledge, survival strategies, and information about plague conditions across wide geographical areas. Some communities invested in infrastructure improvements designed to reduce plague risk. This might include better water systems, improved waste disposal, or the construction of specialized medical facilities. While the scientific understanding behind these improvements was often incorrect, some of them did have beneficial effects on public health. The social changes that occurred during plague years had lasting effects that extended far beyond the disease itself. The breakdown of traditional social hierarchies led to new forms of social mobility and organization. People who might never have had opportunities for advancement in normal times could rise to positions of leadership or authority during plague emergencies. The labor shortages caused by plague deaths led to fundamental changes in economic relationships. Workers gained bargaining power that they had never had before, leading to higher wages, better working conditions, and greater personal freedom. Some historians argue that these changes laid the groundwork for the eventual end of feudalism in much of Europe. The emphasis on practical knowledge and direct observation that developed during plague years contributed to changes in intellectual culture that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution. People who had learned to observe symptoms, test treatments, and adapt strategies based on results were developing approaches that would later be recognized as scientific methods. Women's roles expanded significantly during plague years as traditional gender restrictions became less enforceable when communities were focused on survival. Women took on roles in medicine, trade, leadership, and other areas that had previously been restricted to men. Some of these changes persisted after the plague ended. The international nature of the plague crisis led to increased communication and cooperation between communities and regions. Information networks, trade relationships, and diplomatic contacts that developed during plague years often continued afterward, contributing to the gradual development of more integrated European political and economic systems. Religious practices and beliefs evolved in response to plague experiences. New forms of popular religion developed, often emphasizing personal piety, charitable works, and direct relationships with the divine, rather than institutional hierarchies. These changes contributed to the religious reforms and innovations that would characterize later centuries. Art and literature were profoundly influenced by plague experiences. The themes of death, survival, human resilience, and the fragility of life that emerged from plague years would influence European culture for centuries. Works like Boccaccio's Decameron and the various Danse Macabre artistic traditions reflected both the trauma and the wisdom gained during the plague years. Educational systems adapted to plague conditions in ways that had lasting effects. The need to preserve and transmit knowledge when traditional authorities might die suddenly led to innovations in education and scholarship. Some of the universities and educational institutions founded during plague years became major centers of learning that persisted for centuries. Legal systems evolved to handle the complex inheritance, property, and social issues that arose from plague deaths. New legal concepts and procedures developed during this period influenced the development of European legal systems for generations. Urban planning and public health concepts that emerged during plague years laid groundwork for later developments in city design and public health policy. While the immediate understanding of disease transmission was often incorrect, the principle that community-wide measures were necessary for health protection became established during the plague years. The concept of quarantine, developed during plague years, became a permanent part of public health practice and international law. The procedures and institutions created for plague control provided models for dealing with later epidemic diseases. Economic innovations developed during plague years, including new forms of insurance, banking, and trade organization, had lasting effects on European commercial development. The need to conduct business under conditions of uncertainty and risk led to innovations in risk management and financial planning. The political changes that occurred during plague years, including the rise of new forms of local government and community organization, influenced the development of political systems throughout Europe. Communities that learned to organize for collective survival during plague outbreaks often maintained these organizational capabilities for other purposes. International relations were affected by plague experiences, as communities and nations that had cooperated for mutual survival during plague years often maintained these relationships afterward. The shared experience of dealing with a common threat created bonds that transcended traditional political boundaries. Scientific and medical knowledge advanced significantly during plague years, despite the incorrect theoretical framework within which people were working. The emphasis on careful observation, systematic experimentation, and practical results that developed during plague years contributed to the gradual development of more scientific approaches to medicine and natural philosophy. The social solidarity and community cooperation that developed in many areas during plague years had lasting effects on social organization and cultural values. Communities that had learned to work together for survival often maintained stronger social bonds and more effective collective institutions long after the plague had ended. Agricultural and rural development was influenced by plague experiences, as communities learned new techniques for self-sufficiency, resource management, and adaptation to changing conditions. Some of the agricultural innovations developed during plague years contributed to later improvements in food production and rural prosperity. Trade and manufacturing evolved in response to plague conditions, leading to new forms of commercial organization, production techniques, and market relationships. The need to maintain economic activity under conditions of social disruption led to innovations that proved valuable in other contexts as well. Cultural and intellectual life was permanently changed by plague experiences. The themes, questions, and approaches that emerged from plague years influenced literature, philosophy, art, and scholarship for centuries. The plague years forced people to confront fundamental questions about life, death, community, and human nature that continued to resonate long after the immediate crisis had passed. By the end of the 14th century, as the initial wave of the Black Death began to subside, European society had been fundamentally transformed. The survival strategies that people had developed during the plague years had created new social, economic, political, and cultural patterns that would shape European development for centuries to come. The communities and individuals who had survived had done so not just through luck, but through adaptation, innovation, cooperation, and resilience. They had learned to observe carefully, adapt quickly, work together effectively, and maintain hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. These lessons would prove valuable not just for dealing with later plague outbreaks, which continued to occur periodically for centuries, but for facing other crises and challenges as well. The medical and public health knowledge gained during the plague years, while still limited by the scientific understanding of the time, represented significant advances in practical disease management. The concepts of quarantine, isolation, community health measures, and systematic observation of disease patterns that developed during this period provided foundations for later medical and public health developments. The psychological resilience that people developed during the plague years became part of European cultural heritage. The knowledge that communities could survive seemingly impossible challenges, that individuals could adapt to radically changed circumstances, and that human cooperation could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles became embedded in cultural memory. This resilience would prove crucial in facing later challenges, from wars and famines to other epidemic diseases. The technological innovations that emerged from plague survival needs continued to develop and spread long after the immediate crisis had passed. Improvements in sanitation, food preservation, transportation, communication, and medical equipment that had been developed for plague survival often found applications in peacetime as well. The social innovations that emerged during plague years, including new forms of community organization, mutual aid systems, and collective decision-making processes, became permanent features of many European communities. The experience of having to reorganize society rapidly in response to crisis had demonstrated that social structures were more flexible and adaptable than previously believed. The economic transformations that occurred during plague years laid groundwork for the commercial and financial developments that would characterize the Renaissance and early modern periods. The need to conduct business under conditions of uncertainty and disruption had led to innovations in banking, insurance, trade organization, and risk management that proved valuable in many other contexts. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, as Europe began to recover from the initial devastation of the Black Death, it was clear that the continent had emerged from the crisis fundamentally changed. The population losses had been catastrophic, but the survivors had developed new capabilities, new institutions, new forms of knowledge, and new ways of organizing society that would prove remarkably durable and influential. The plague outbreaks continued periodically throughout the following centuries, but European communities were now much better prepared to deal with them. They had institutional frameworks for implementing quarantine and isolation measures, practical knowledge about disease prevention and treatment, established networks for sharing information and resources, and cultural traditions of community cooperation and mutual aid that had been strengthened during the original crisis. The children and grandchildren of plague survivors inherited not just the material consequences of the demographic and social changes caused by the plague, but also the knowledge, skills, and cultural patterns that had enabled survival. This inheritance included practical knowledge about disease prevention, community organization skills, traditions of innovation and adaptation, and cultural values that emphasized resilience, cooperation, and the importance of preserving knowledge and institutions for future generations. The long-term demographic consequences of the plague were enormous, but they were not simply negative. The population reduction had eliminated the overcrowding and resource scarcity that had characterized much of 13th and early 14th century Europe. Survivors often found themselves with access to better agricultural land, improved living conditions, and greater economic opportunities than their ancestors had enjoyed. The technological and agricultural innovations that had been developed during plague years contributed to improved productivity and living standards during the recovery period. Better food preservation techniques, improved agricultural methods, more efficient transportation systems, and enhanced communication networks all helped communities rebuild more effectively than might otherwise have been possible. The educational and cultural institutions that had been created or strengthened during plague years became centers for the preservation and development of knowledge during the recovery period. The universities, libraries, and scholarly networks that had survived the plague often became focal points for intellectual and cultural development in the following centuries. The artistic and literary traditions that had emerged from plague experiences continued to develop and influence European culture throughout the Renaissance and beyond. The themes of human mortality, resilience, and community solidarity that had been central to plague-era culture remained important elements in European art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. The religious innovations that had developed during plague years contributed to the religious reforms and developments that would characterize the later medieval and early modern periods. The emphasis on personal piety, charitable works, and direct spiritual experience that had emerged from plague experiences influenced both popular religion and institutional religious development. The legal and political innovations that had been developed for dealing with plague-related problems became permanent features of European legal and political systems. Concepts of public health authority, emergency government powers, and community responsibility for collective welfare that had been pioneered during plague years became established principles of European governance. The international networks and relationships that had developed for sharing information and resources during plague years became foundations for the increased international cooperation and communication that characterized the Renaissance period. The experience of facing a common threat that transcended national boundaries had demonstrated the value of international cooperation and information sharing. As we move through the 15th century, we see how the survival strategies developed during the Black Death continued to evolve and spread. Communities that had successfully weathered the initial plague outbreaks became models for others, and their techniques and institutions were copied and adapted across Europe and beyond. The merchant networks that had adapted to plague conditions became more sophisticated and extensive during the recovery period. The techniques for conducting safe long-distance trade, managing commercial risks, and maintaining business relationships despite periodic disease outbreaks became standard practices that facilitated the commercial expansion of the Renaissance period. The medical knowledge that had been gained through plague experience continued to develop through continued observation and experimentation. While the theoretical framework remained largely unchanged, practical medical knowledge continued to improve through the accumulated experience of treating plague and other diseases. The public health institutions that had been created during plague years became permanent features of European cities and communities. Hospitals, quarantine facilities, and health authorities that had been established as emergency measures became regular parts of urban infrastructure and governance. The agricultural communities that had developed self-sufficiency strategies during plague years often maintained these capabilities, making them more resilient and prosperous during the recovery period. The techniques for food production, preservation, and storage that had been developed for survival purposes proved valuable for improving general living standards. The social support systems that had been created during plague years evolved into more formal institutions for community welfare. The networks of mutual aid, resource sharing, and collective assistance that had been crucial for survival became established features of community organization. The educational innovations that had been developed for preserving knowledge during plague years contributed to the educational developments of the Renaissance period. The techniques for rapid knowledge transmission, preservation of essential information, and training of new specialists became standard educational practices. The cultural traditions of storytelling, music, and art that had been important for maintaining morale during plague years continued to develop and flourish during the recovery period. The themes and techniques that had been developed for providing psychological support and community cohesion became permanent features of European cultural life. By the early 16th century, nearly 2 centuries after the initial arrival of the Black Death, it was clear that European civilization had not simply recovered from the plague, but had been permanently transformed by the survival strategies and innovations developed during the crisis years. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was more urban, more commercial, more technologically advanced, more politically sophisticated, and more culturally dynamic than the Europe that had existed before the plague. The demographic recovery was remarkably rapid in many areas, as improved living conditions and economic opportunities encouraged population growth. However, this recovery was built on the foundation of the survival strategies and institutional innovations that had been developed during the plague years. The economic prosperity of the Renaissance period was made possible in part by the commercial and financial innovations that had been developed for conducting business during plague years. The techniques for managing risk, maintaining trade networks despite disruptions, and organizing commercial enterprises under uncertain conditions became standard business practices. The artistic and cultural achievements of the Renaissance were built on the foundation of the cultural institutions and traditions that had been created or strengthened during plague years. The emphasis on human experience, individual achievement, and community solidarity that characterized Renaissance culture had roots in the plague-era focus on survival, adaptation, and mutual support. The scientific developments of the early modern period grew out of the empirical observations and practical experimentation that had been necessitated by plague survival needs. The emphasis on direct observation, systematic testing, and practical results that had been crucial for developing effective survival strategies became established features of European intellectual culture. The political developments of the early modern period were influenced by the concepts of public authority, emergency governance, and community responsibility that had been pioneered during plague years. The idea that governments had responsibility for public health and community welfare, and that communities had the right to organize for collective survival, became established principles of European political thought. The religious developments of the Reformation period were influenced by the religious innovations and spiritual traditions that had emerged during plague years. The emphasis on personal piety, direct spiritual experience, and charitable works that had been characteristic of plague-era religion continued to influence European religious development. The international relationships and diplomatic practices of the early modern period were built on the foundation of the cooperation and communication networks that had been developed for dealing with plague as a shared international threat. The experience of international cooperation for mutual survival became a model for later forms of international relations. As we reach the end of our journey through the survival strategies of the Black Death era, it becomes clear that the people who lived through this catastrophic period accomplished something remarkable. They not only survived what may have been the worst pandemic in human history, but they did so in ways that fundamentally improved human civilization. The survival strategies they developed were not just temporary expedients for getting through a crisis, but innovations that proved valuable for centuries afterward. The institutional frameworks they created, the knowledge they preserved and developed, the social practices they established, and the cultural traditions they maintained became permanent features of European civilization and, through European influence, of global human culture. The medical knowledge they developed laid foundations for modern public health and epidemiology. The quarantine and isolation practices they pioneered became standard tools for disease control. The hospital and healthcare institutions they created became models for medical care systems. The systematic observation and documentation practices they developed became foundations for scientific medicine. The social innovations they developed became models for community organization and mutual aid that influenced social development for centuries. The techniques for maintaining social cohesion during crisis, organizing collective responses to shared threats, and preserving essential knowledge and institutions became permanent features of European social organization. The economic innovations they developed became foundations for modern commercial and financial systems. The techniques for conducting business under uncertainty, managing commercial risks, organizing complex trade networks, and maintaining economic activity despite social disruptions became standard business practices. The political innovations they developed became foundations for modern concepts of public health authority, emergency governance, and community responsibility for collective welfare. The legal frameworks they created for dealing with epidemic diseases became models for public health law. The cultural and intellectual innovations they developed became foundations for Renaissance humanism, scientific methodology, and modern educational practices. The emphasis on practical knowledge, direct observation, and individual capability that was necessitated by survival needs became permanent features of European intellectual culture. The international cooperation and communication networks they developed became models for later forms of international relations and global cooperation. The experience of facing a shared global threat that required coordinated international response provided lessons that remained relevant for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, the people who survived the Black Death demonstrated that human communities could adapt to even the most catastrophic circumstances, that individuals could develop remarkable resilience and capability when faced with extreme challenges, and that cooperation and mutual aid could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Their legacy is not just the specific techniques and institutions they developed, but the demonstration that human creativity, adaptability, and solidarity can triumph over even the most devastating crises. They showed that catastrophe, while terrible, can also be an opportunity for innovation, improvement, and positive change. The survival strategies of the Black Death era remind us that even in the darkest times, people can find ways not just to survive, but to create better ways of living. They show us that crisis can catalyze innovation, that necessity can drive creativity, and that communities can emerge from catastrophe stronger and more capable than before. Their story is ultimately a story of hope. Not the naive hope that bad things won't happen, but the realistic hope that when bad things do happen, people can find ways to cope, adapt, survive, and even thrive. It's a story that reminds us that human beings are remarkably resilient, creative, and capable of working together to overcome even the most daunting challenges. As we face our own challenges and uncertainties in the modern world, the survival strategies of the Black Death era offer both practical lessons and inspiration. They remind us of the importance of community cooperation, the value of preserving and sharing knowledge, the necessity of adapting quickly to changing circumstances, and the power of human ingenuity in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The people who survived the Black Death left us more than just their genetic inheritance. They left us a legacy of knowledge, institutions, cultural practices, and most importantly, the example of what human beings can accomplish when they work together with determination, creativity, and mutual support. Their story shows us that survival is not just about individual endurance, but about community resilience, that progress can emerge from crisis, and that the human capacity for adaptation and improvement is virtually limitless. They remind us that even the darkest chapters in human history can also be stories of remarkable human achievement. And so, as we conclude this long journey through one of history's most challenging periods, we're left not with despair about human vulnerability, but with admiration for human capability. Not with fear about future challenges, but with confidence in our collective ability to face whatever may come. And not with a sense of endings, but with a sense of continuity and hope for what human communities can accomplish when they work together with wisdom, courage, and determination. The survivors of the Black Death remind us that no matter how dark the night may seem, people can find ways to keep the light burning, to preserve what's valuable, to create what's needed, and to build a better tomorrow from the ashes of yesterday's disasters. Their legacy lives on, not just in the institutions and knowledge they created, but in the enduring human capacity for resilience, innovation, and hope that they so powerfully demonstrated. And with that thought, we can rest easy knowing that the human spirit, tested by the greatest challenges, has always found a way to not just survive, but to flourish,
and we can face our own futures with confidence that this remarkable capacity for survival and renewal continues to burn brightly within us all.
Good night.